National Historic Site of national significance since 1968. We have 4 plays a year here, and Ford's Theater Society, our partners, they work to bring this alive as a thriving institution to the performing arts in recognition of President Lincoln's own love of theater in his day. So you're at a very unique historic entity in that respect with its dual function here, and I would wager to say we're probably the most significant Civil War site downtown here in the federal city, overseen by the National Park Service. The theater boxes that you see on either side of the stage at the balcony level are no longer utilized by theater goers today, but back in Mr. Lincoln's day, small groups did reserve the theater boxes for privacy. President Lincoln was the only president to attend the theater here in the 19th century, and normally when he came, he would always reserve that box there before you. That's exactly the way it appeared as you see it on that fateful night of April 14th, 1865, while seated watching the play Our American Cousin. President Lincoln is shot by actor John Wilkes Booth from behind. You will notice there's a frame of great print of George Washington. And the reason you see a print of George Washington in front center is that is how the Ford brothers, who owned the theater, who ran it, would have designated the theater box for the president in those days. George Washington, father of our country, first president, is the emblematic figure of the country, essentially, up until President Lincoln's assassination here and the conclusion of the Civil War. And following that, in a manner of speaking, Lincoln displaces George Washington as the emblematic figure of the nation. We know President Lincoln came here at Ford's Theater several times to watch plays while carrying the country through the most horrific war in its history, the Civil War, the war between the states, the clash between the North and the South, a war in which over 675,000 Americans would perish. And it was here that Mr. Lincoln liked to immerse himself in Shakespearean tragedy, Shakespearean plays, as well as reading very deeply in Shakespearean literature. And his enjoyment of Shakespearean plays here at Ford's Theater, that's where the figure of John Wilkes Booth comes in. John Wilkes Booth was a prominent Shakespearean actor, very well known to the American public. He was part of a well-known acting family. The Booth family was from Maryland and next door to the federal city here. John Wilkes had 2 other brothers that were also very well-known actors, Edwin Booth and Junius Brutus Booth Jr., and John Wilkes, along with his brothers, were quite well known in performing in theaters all around the country. Many of the great Shakespearean classics, such plays as Hamlet, Richard III, Julius Caesar. John Wilkes in particular was a very, very striking figure, comparable to the most renowned star you can think of today in his own time. And he was particularly talented and noteworthy in scenes before audiences involving violence, bloodshed, murder, very athletic and agile, a great stuntman. At the same time, he's well known as an actor. In 1861, when the war begins, he is also a deep Southern sympathizer, supporter of the South and the Southern Confederacy, unbeknownst to virtually everyone at the time except the immediate members of his family. When the war began, no one had any idea, including John Wilkes Booth, that this war between North and South would go on for 4 long years. But as the war continued and dragged on, an unprecedented and horrific death and destruction would follow in its wake. John Wilkes Booth became more and more convinced as time passed that President Lincoln, in his determination to preserve the Union at all costs, suppress the South's attempt to secede, withdraw, and form its own independent country, the Confederate States of America, was ultimately responsible for all this death and misfortune that had been inflicted upon the country, and particularly upon the people of the South. Now, this was nothing unique during the war because there were many harsh critics of Lincoln and his policies. Numerous opposition newspapers were highly critical of the manner in which Lincoln was carrying out his war policies. And many of the ways in which the opposition newspapers during the war caricatured President Lincoln politically had a very profound impact upon John Wilkes Booth's mind and his fears for the future. And I do believe it was a fear within his mind. Ultimately, Booth believed that if the North prevailed, the Union was then preserved, that President Lincoln would then go on to make himself into a permanent ruler, king, dictator. God knows what would happen to Republican self-government as the country knew it up to that time. Now, by the spring of 1865, after almost 4 years of war, John Wilkes Booth is rarely ever seen in theaters acting. He has become a spy for the Confederacy, providing intelligence to an underground Confederate network, Confederate agents who in turn have connections to the Confederate government and the regime in Richmond, Virginia. And John Wilkes Booth's original plan was in fact not to assassinate President Lincoln, but was to kidnap him and carry him south and hold him as a hostage. Not only John Wilkes Booth was looking to undertake this, but also Confederate agents. The motivation behind doing this, if they could successfully kidnap Lincoln and hold him as a hostage, as ransom, it was believed that the Confederacy could get peace terms favorable to them from the Lincoln administration or keep the war going on indefinitely. This kidnapping scheme never materializes as John Wilkes Booth had hoped. It proves to be ultimately too dangerous an undertaking. In the spring of 1865, after almost nearly 4 years of war, John Wilkes Booth begins to entertain the idea of assassinating the president. The U.S. president had never been assassinated before in the country's history. And John Wilkes Booth believes if he can successfully take out the political head of the regime, the Union in the North, as opposed to the military, he might thereby be able to give the South and the Confederacy one last chance. Now that opportunity would afford itself on the morning of April 14, 1865, 5 days following the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces to General Grant's Union forces at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. With Robert E. Lee's surrender on April 9th, the war is by no means over, because the Confederate government still is in existence. Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, is in flight southward, determined to keep the war going. There still are numerous other Confederate armies out in the field that have yet to surrender. And on that morning, John Wilkes Booth arrives here at Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. And he's greeted out in front of the theater by Harry Ford, one of the Ford brothers, who tells Booth that President Lincoln will be here for a play that night called Our American Cousin. Our American Cousin is a comedy. It's a play John Wilkes Booth knows very well. When he learns this, he knows President Lincoln will be situated there in that theater box before you. And he sees his opportunity to carry out his plan to shoot Lincoln, because he knows he can use his fame as an actor that night to talk his way into that theater box. Subsequently, on that afternoon, Booth would set into motion his plans very methodically, which would involve not only assassinating President Lincoln on that night, but also assassinating Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, and Lincoln's Vice President, Andrew Johnson, also targeted. Their assassinations to be carried out by fellow co-conspirators with Booth that night simultaneously, in order to decapitate the head of the Union government, throw the country into turmoil, and maybe thereby give the South one last chance. Meanwhile, President Lincoln, and that same morning, is over at the White House, directly 6 blocks west of here. Mr. Lincoln's rather happy. The war is winding down. President and Mrs. Lincoln sent a messenger here to the Ford's Theater to alert the Ford brothers, 10:30 a.m., that they plan to be here that night for the play. The Ford brothers, upon receiving the news, are very excited. They anticipate a full house here in the theater with Lincoln in attendance. They will be busily decorating that theater box, getting everything ready in order. It is announced in the newspapers to the American public. President and Mrs. Lincoln will be here as well. President and Mrs. Lincoln will invite 2 guests, friends, to accompany them, to be with them in that theater box for the play that night. Their names are Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, a lady by the name of Clara Harris, who at the last minute will accept the Lincoln's invitation. 8 p.m. rolls around. Full packed house here in the theater. Close to 1,800 in attendance. Today, the theater accommodates 654. These are not the original seats. There were many more. It was also seating on what's called the family circle, that uppermost sector tier. That was completely open. Bench row seating. Over 1,000 more theater goers could have been squeezed up there in 1865. There were no fire codes, gas lighting on the stage. Lighting was considerably dimmer. The play begins. President and Mrs. Lincoln are not here at the theater. Still over at the White House. The last hour. I've been inundated with visitors. Not until about 20 past the hour, President and Mrs. Lincoln are able to free themselves. And as Mr. Lincoln prepared to board his carriage just outside in front of the White House, it was recorded. Instead of saying his customary good night as he always did to his bodyguard, he says strangely for the first time, "Goodbye, William." President and Mrs. Lincoln on their way here to the theater, having picked up their guests when their carriage pulls up in front of Ford's Theater. It's around 8:30 p.m. They are greeted by a bodyguard, John Parker, the Metropolitan Police. He will escort President and Mrs. Lincoln and their guests into the theater lobby, proceed up a spiral staircase to the balcony, and make their way behind the seating area over towards the side wall. For the actors on stage here, the play in progress, Laura Keene, leading actress that night. This is her 1,000th performance. Seeing President Lincoln had arrived from the theater balcony, motioned to the other actors on the stage, and the play is stopped. And this orchestra pit that you see in front of the stage here, we're situated about 12 musicians who will then strike up Hail to the Chief to let everybody in the audience know that, in fact, Mr. Lincoln had arrived. As that is played, the presidential party will make their way towards that outer yellow door. Those you can see that outer yellow theater box door. That's the only way to gain access into the theater box for you there. And Mr. Lincoln tipping his hat just before stepping in. And once Mr. Lincoln is seated inside along with the others, as you face the theater box, Mr. Lincoln is seated on the far right-hand side in a walnut rocking chair. Seated alongside him in the black cane chair, just to the right of the print of Washington, and his wife, Mary Lincoln, Seated over to the far left side is Miss Clara Harris. Seated behind her on the love sofa is Major Rathbone. There, Mr. Lincoln is considered safe. The guard's primary responsibility was to see to it that Mr. Lincoln got safely inside the theater and safely seated there. That's it. There's no systematic presidential protection as we know it today. The play resumes. Meanwhile, John Wilkes Booth knows that the president has arrived at around 9 p.m. just behind Ford's Theater. There's an alley. He'll ride his horse up to the backside of the theater building. And the alley's still there. It goes right up here to F Street. You can see the historic marker. If you go right up to the intersection, hang a right, and enters through a back rear doorway well behind the stage set. Calls one of the stagehands, a scene shifter named Edmund Spangler, to watch his horse for him, while he then proceeded to a trapdoor in the far back. Booth will pull up a trapdoor in the far back, descend down a set of steps underneath the stage, and will make his way underneath over on this side. Comes up an opposite set of steps at another trapdoor, knows all the corridors, passageways very well throughout the building, then proceeds through a hallway in between the theater here and what was next door on this side, a saloon. It's called the Star Saloon. For those of you that came up from the museum down below the theater here, where you walked by the hour-by-hour panels, the Lincoln Booth timeline, the clock was ticking just before you stepped into the historic theater lobby. That's exactly where John Wilkes Booth would have walked to the end exit door and enters into the Star Saloon next door to have a drink and to kill some time. And while John Wilkes Booth was in the saloon, it was recorded that the saloon keeper said to him that he would never be the actor that his father was, Junius Brutus Booth, Sr., to which John Wilkes Booth replied back, "When I leave the stage tonight, I'll be the most famous man in history." Now, it's important to point out, by virtue of the fact of that remark, that you have a renowned public figure such as he is, carries out the shooting of Lincoln here in the theater during the play before an audience. And clearly, John Wilkes Booth wants this to be a public act for all to see. This is somewhat unique, ladies and gentlemen, in contrast to other assassins who would go to great lengths to conceal their identity as snipers, if you will. That's part of it. But even more significantly, I would suggest to you all that within his own mind, Booth views the shooting and slaying Lincoln here in the theater, if you will, that night, as the culmination and the climax of his acting career as a tragedian. For example, if you're familiar with the play, the story of Julius Caesar, the ancient Roman Republic, Brutus, who slays Julius Caesar in order to save the Roman Republic from tyranny, prevent it from becoming an empire, an imperialistic empire. But John Wilkes Booth is very much influenced by this analogy, in that he sees himself, if you will, called upon history to slay the perceived tyrant Lincoln in order to save his beloved republic, the Confederate States of America, from tyranny. Thereby will be hailed a hero by the people of the South for what he is about to undertake, but will ultimately be vindicated by history and posterity for his deed, or so he thinks. Shortly after 10 p.m., Booth steps out of the Star Saloon, re-enters Ford's Theater from out front. It's Act 3, Scene 2 of Our American Cousin. Booth proceeded up the spiral staircase onto the theater balcony, same way the President, Miss Lincoln, and the guests would have come in. Makes his way behind the seating area over towards the side wall. Many in the theater that night during the play, they saw Booth, instantly, famously recognizable. In fact, many on the balcony level, as they saw Booth casually make his approach towards that outer yellow door, they thought that President Lincoln had sent a messenger and summoned John Wilkes Booth here to Ford's Theater that night, maybe wanting to say hello to him. President Lincoln knew of John Wilkes Booth as an actor, had seen him perform here in a play called The Marble Harp. But while they knew of one another, there's no record we know of that they ever met one another face to face. In any event, based on eyewitness accounts, as Booth approached to that outer yellow door, he casually reached into his pocket, pulled out a calling card of some sort, presented it to a messenger named Charles Forbes, who was seated just outside by that outer yellow door, who had taken the place of the guard Parker, who it's believed wandered somewhere else in the theater. You have to understand that it was more customary than mandatory for the guard to remain just outside that outer theater box door in case President Lincoln needed to run any messages. Words are exchanged between the two. John Wilkes Booth simply probably said he wanted to pay his respects to Mr. Lincoln. He's admitted in. No reason not to. Once Booth goes through that outer yellow door, quickly closes it behind him, and then grabs an elongated wood bar he had earlier hidden behind that door. He'll throw it up between the door and the wall, effectively barricading that outer yellow door so that no one can follow behind. It then proceeds towards the two other doors, one marked Box 7, Box 8. There is only one actor on the stage at that point, Harry Hawk, playing the American cousin. He does not know that Booth has just gone through that door. He is about to utter the funniest line of the entire play. The line that Hawk uttered went like this, quote, "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you sock-dologizing old man-trap," unquote. Back in 1865. That was pretty funny, ladies and gentlemen. Imagine, if you will, a roar of laughter as at that instant that Booth steps through one of those two doors, unseen and unheard, from behind, pulls out a single shot point, 44 Derringer pistol, levels it at the back of Lincoln's head just a few inches away. At that instant, Lincoln is leaning slightly forward, the rocker, his head turned, looking down towards the audience, perhaps that maybe recognized somebody. Booth fires the weapon, the bullet enters just above Lincoln's left ear, travels partially through the brain, lodging up behind the right eye. When Lincoln is shot, he slumps immediately unconscious in the rocker, but is not killed outright, and as gun smoke ascends up and out of that theater box, Major Rathbone, hearing a muffled sound with the laughter, turns. As he sees the gun smoke slowly clear, sees Booth standing behind the rocker, his first thought is, take him out immediately. Booth drops the Derringer to the floor of the theater box, pulls out a knife blade. Rathbone thereupon raises his left arm in order to shield himself. Booth takes the weapon and inflicts a stab wound in Rathbone's left arm down to the bone. Rathbone reels back from the stab wound. Booth then bolts, leaps over the balustrade to the right of the Prince of Washington. As Booth leaps over, it's believed he catches his spur in his riding boot, and the center U.S. Treasury Regimental Guards flag there, causing him to fall off balance, crashing into the stage, right in this area here, 12 feet, possibly breaking the left leg. With the bloody dagger still in his hand, from which he has just stabbed Major Rathbone, he slowly rises on the stage here, turns, faces the audience, utters the words most said they heard, Sic semper tyrannis. That's the Latin, thus ever to tyrants. Going back to Brutus. So, major public figure on a stage, making a public utterance for all to see and hear. Then at a quick pace in this direction, Booth proceeds towards the back rear door where he first came in, mounts his horse behind the theater and escapes. By the time Booth steps through that inner door to the time he's out the back rear door, no more than 10 to 15 seconds has elapsed. Well, the audience sees John Wilkes Booth jump onto the stage, raise the bloody dagger, and yell out the words. They all think it's part of the play. They all recognize him as an actor. No idea what has happened. Not until some seconds after Booth's disappearance, Major Rathbone cries out from that theater box, "Stop that man! Somebody stop that man!" And the scream then immediately follows Mary Lincoln. Stunned silence in the theater, and then slowly, total pandemonium and chaos starts to ensue throughout the whole theater. Major Rathbone, now bleeding profusely from the stab wound inflicted, cries out for a surgeon. Any surgeon in the theater to come to the aid. Several men, they rush towards that outer yellow door, they pound on the door, they try to get in. Rathbone is able to finally make his way towards that outer door. From behind, dislodges the wood bar. First doctor to come to the aid that night, Dr. Charles Leal, 23 years old, steps in, sees his trail of blood on the floor just beyond that outer yellow door, steps into the theater box, sees the unconscious Lincoln slumped in the rocker, believes it is Lincoln's blood that he sees on the floor from Rathbone. He proceeds to lay the unconscious Lincoln down on the floor of the theater box, frantically looking for a stab wound. Can't find anything. Notices Lincoln's eyes are closed, so he checks his head, finds behind the head a bullet wound. As he examines the point of entry, instantly knows, gunshot wound to the head. It is impossible for him to recover. Dr. Leal informs the now emotional, hysterical Mary Lincoln there. The first thought that comes across Dr. Leal's mind is getting President Lincoln to a bed. The closest bed that can be found. There is no other place to carry Mr. Lincoln but to the closest bed. Otherwise, he will die here in the theater. So the decision will be made by Dr. Leal and his surgeon, Charles Sabin Taft. After about several minutes of chaos in there, they'll have the unconscious Lincoln lifted, several men carrying the president, Dr. Leal leading the way, carried out of there, clearing the path, through the balcony, down the spiral staircase. As they step out in front of the theater, and a huge crowd and commotion begins to form out in front of Ford's Theater, Dr. Leo, looking out across the street, dark of the night, gas lamps are lit up, see some rural boarding houses there, pondering that there is a spare bed perhaps in one of these homes. They walk Lincoln's body next door on this side to the Star Saloon. They inquire to the owners to the availability of a bed. They're told no bed available. They then walk Lincoln's body several yards up in this direction in front of the theater, and then back down, and lo and behold, a boarder emerges from the Peterson boarding house, owned by an obscure family, William and Anna Peterson. Henry Safford, hearing all this noise outside, he opens the front door of the boarding house, holds out a candle to investigate, and as he sees the unconscious President Lincoln being held across the street by the men in front of the theater, he cries out to them, "Bring him in here, bring him in here." So there, history will be made in that home that night. Mr. Lincoln is carried to a small room at the end of the hall on the first floor, and a bed readily available in that small room, in a room normally occupied by Willie Clark, a Union clerk who was out that night probably celebrating the winding down of the war. And there Lincoln is placed diagonally. The bed is too short. Torso propped up on the pillows, feet hanging on the other corner. As a 9-hour death watch commences there, and Lincoln never regains consciousness. And all during this ordeal, through the late evening and early morning hours, Mary Lincoln will be confined to a front parlor in the house in grief, comforted by various friends. While adjoining back bedroom, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, one of the first to arrive in Lincoln's cabinet, will launch the investigation from that room. He will serve as the acting president of the country during those 9 hours, interviews witnesses in the Peterson house, ascertains it was John Wilkes Booth, the assassin, and the largest manhunt in U.S. history commences, and telegrams are orders sent out from the War Department, messenger from the Peterson house to the War Department, and the house is placed under guard. John Wilkes Booth will be a fugitive on the run for the next 12 days through southern Maryland and into Virginia. Not until the early morning hours, April 26, 1865, the Union troops will catch up with him. The 16th New York Cavalry, due to the fact that he has a broken left leg, is never able to escape to the Deep South and is ultimately shot and killed by a Union sergeant named Boston Corbett at the Richard Garrett barn. And that barn where Booth was hiding out is set afire in order to force Booth out. David Harold, one of the conspirators, surrenders to the authorities, comes out, and Corbett, seeing Booth armed in that barn with a carbine, believing he had a divine revelation from God to do so, takes his pistol, takes aim without orders, shooting Booth through the neck and instantly paralyzing him. Booth will be pulled out of that burning barn by the Union troops, but will die 2 hours later, never brought back alive. But the end will come for Mr. Lincoln. 07:22 a.m. that next morning, April 15th, 1865, he will draw his last breath. And present in that room were several individuals at that very moment. They included Secretary of War Stanton, Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's oldest son, James Tanner, a stenographer who assisted the Secretary of War during the course of the investigation, Dr. Charles Leal, who initially treated the president in the theater, remained by his bedside, holding his arm to let him know that he had a friend the entire time he was unconscious, Surgeon General Barnes, and the Pastor Gurley, who administered the last blessings at that moment. Thank you.